No idea health care and all the torturous debate around the Affordable Care Act and all of the debate we've had and all the attempts at trying to dismantle it that have occurred, the idea that we wouldn't be allowed 24 hours to offer amendments on a subject matter so incredibly important, what would be the harm, Mr. Chairman? What would be the harm in allowing us to offer amendments on that subject matter? I need to understand, what is it we're afraid of?
Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Toomey.
Yeah, I would just respond. It's my understanding that existing amendments can be completely modified. My Democratic colleagues have submitted, I don't know how many amendments. Is it in the hundreds? It's a large number. It's in the hundreds. Every one of them can be modified to deal with this very issue.
So
and if that is what members want to do, they'll be free to do it. I don't understand this argument that it's not possible for Democrats to offer amendments on health care issues. I suspect there's going to be a lot of them, and you've got the vehicle with which to do it.
I don't understand it either.
I'm a new committee member. Explain it to me, Mr. Chairman. You're saying I can take an amendment that I've offered on a pass-through guardrail, and I can say, by the way, I want to include something on the Affordable Care Act? Is that what I can do? I can just rewrite the body of the amendment to add an addendum that deals with health care?
You can certainly modify it.
Mr. Chairman and colleagues, we're talking about a whole new subject, a subject that, as I've indicated, can raise health insurance premiums on millions of people. And I think this is a modest request, why I called, and I haven't done this, for an opportunity for members to vote on whether or not we ought to have until 5 p.m. tomorrow to submit additional amendments. And obviously, Mr. Bartold, we're going to be interested in whether your distributional analysis is going to be updated to include the individual mandates. So there are a host of questions, which is the point Senator McCaskill has mentioned. And Mr. Chairman, I know you want to move on, and some colleagues want to do, and if we could vote on my motion.
Let's see, are there any other comments?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Senator Stabenow.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the ranking member's motion, and I just want to indicate this is a very unfortunate turn. Instead of having something that's going to be in this tax bill that will actually raise premiums, healthcare premiums, what we should be doing is focusing on a bipartisan effort that Senator Alexander and Senator Murray have put together to stabilize the markets that would actually begin to lower premiums. And so this is a very unfortunate turn of events, and also makes me very skeptical about what is coming next when there's a $1.5 trillion debt increase built into this bill, and then the next thing we see is a budget resolution with about $1.5 trillion in cuts to Medicaid and Medicare. So if we're going down this road, you know, there's a whole lot of concerns that I know people in Michigan will have about their health care.
Parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Chairman, before we vote.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So Senator Toomey has said everything's going to be hunky-dory here, that we're going to be able to talk about our concerns with this amendment. I would just like to have clarified by the majority that health amendments would not be ruled as non-germane, that all the health amendments within the jurisdiction of this committee be considered germane. I think that is I think that's a minimum commitment given the importance of this very important issue, which, as I say, just flew in through the door in the last couple of hours.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, my understanding is that the individual mandate is a tax collected by the IRS. At the individual mandate, the Supreme Court ruled, is a tax. So it seems to me it's perfectly within the jurisdiction of this committee to move forward and address something that is imposing a mandatory tax on millions of Americans who, for simply choosing not to buy health insurance. That's what we're talking about here. This is a tax that punishes people for doing something that they wouldn't want to do. So it seemed to me it's perfectly within this committee's jurisdiction to address this in the form of an amendment. And so I don't know what the outrage is about this not being germane or pertinent to the subject before us.
Mr. Chairman, just before I yield to my colleague, let's understand this redefines the scope of this markup. We didn't know anything about this, and that's why it is so important that we get the time to address it, because this, in all the particulars, redefines the scope of this markup.
Well,
Mr. Chairman, how is it outside the scope?
Chairman is going to speak.
It's a tax. It's IRS.
What?
Internal Revenue Code. I don't know how it's outside the scope.
Chairman.
Okay, now here, let me just make this comment. The Democrats have offered around 60 amendments with no text at all. Seems to me they're awfully easy to modify. There's nothing strange about this at all. And I don't get the crying.
Mr. Chairman, I think the question still is germaneness, and that's what is most relevant to the question that Senator McCaskill asked, to make sure that she is actually going to be able to offer amendments within our jurisdiction. I still haven't heard an answer to
Josh, why don't you clear this up for us? What is doable?
During the ACA, members were able to completely modify their amendments in any way possible. So
there's nothing to stop them from doing it here?
There is no, based upon that precedent, there is no way that members could easily offer and change their amendments as they wish.
So I want to hear the words healthcare amendments are germane, because that's what's going to be asked tomorrow, in my view, unless we clarify this.
I can't speak to germaneness, Senator Wyden. That is up to the chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Well, let's understand. To be germane, they have to be related to the Internal Revenue Code. And at least the individual mandate is the Internal Revenue Code. So that's my understanding. I don't see any problem here.
Mr. Chairman, we have redefined the scope of the bill to health care. We were not talking about health care in the Senate Finance Committee until about an hour ago. So I think it is only fair to allow members to submit additional amendments related to health care in the jurisdiction of the committee. This is now, on the basis of the announcement that's been made, a major health care bill.
Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman?
Well, yes, Senator Cassidy. I'm sorry.
I have a question for the ranking member.
Go ahead, Senator Cassidy.
This is for Senator Wyden or maybe Senator McCaskill. Senator Thune points out that the individual mandate is a tax. But I'm getting from you, when you want to open up all health care, you'd like to bring up Medicaid, 340B, Medicare Part D. I mean, that's the jurisdiction this committee has over health care. Are we really saying because we're discussing something which has been declared a tax, which is a tax, that we're now going to go and bring in Medicaid and 340B? I mean, that just seems like a stretch. And as loud as the volume can be, and as forceful as the delivery, I got to admit, this is a tax, and it's not 340B, and it's not Medicaid. I don't quite get the connection between the whole scope of health care that this committee has and that which is specifically a tax.
Mr. Chairman, if I can respond to my colleague, this is related to a host of other health care issues. This is partial repeal of the Affordable Care Act. And that's why the Congressional Budget Office scored it with such ominous consequences. Millions of people losing coverage, millions of people having their premiums go up. My colleague has been involved in health care. We'll have far fewer healthy people go into the risk pool which means that premiums are going to go up in this country. This is turning a tax bill into a health care bill with our colleagues getting an hour's worth of notice.
But that does not address my question. If you wish to address the consequences of the individual mandate repeal, that's one thing. But if you want to bring in everything that this committee has to do with health care, 340B, for example, that is a stretch, and that is far beyond the scope of what we're discussing here.
We're happy to make this.
Let's ask for recognition by the
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, from here on in, I'm tired of this. It's jumping in and yelling and screaming. I don't want any more yelling and screaming. Let's just talk like gentlemen here and women and women and ladies, and let's treat each other with respect. Now, I've made my ruling. The Internal Revenue Code related amendments would be in scope. That's it. Now, let's just move on.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Wyden.
Thank you. To respond.
Let's run this like it needs to be run.
To respond to my colleague from Louisiana.
Yeah.
We're interested in making sure that it is germane to offer amendments related to the Affordable Care Act. That's what the individual mandate is all about. And I don't think we have locked this issue down. And, Mr. Chairman, unless colleagues want to keep speaking, for those who have just come in, what we have pending is I've asked unanimous consent that members have until 5 tomorrow to submit additional amendments related to this matter of health care and the Affordable Care Act. We have been turned down. The chair ruled against us, and what is pending is an appeal of the ruling of the chair.
Senator from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Chairman, I think I would like to respond to the ranking member's concern by saying, look, everything in the tax code relates to something. We have provisions in the tax reform bill that affect the financial services industry. It affects trade. It affects every industry in the economy because every industry pays taxes. That doesn't mean the entire universe is open for amendment and germane. What is germane is anything that directly affects the Internal Revenue Code because this issue is a tax. It's very clear. It's a tax. So I don't understand the concern. Our Democratic colleagues can modify the amendments. They've submitted 60 blank amendments. They can fill those in. And to the extent that they are related to the code, they're presumably going to be ruled germane as our amendment is germane. So I just don't see the issue here, Mr. Chairman.
I have something else to say, but certainly Senator McCaskill's wanting to speak, and I have one other point, Mr. Chairman.
Well, let me just make the point. You have 60 blank amendments. You can use them. I mean, there's nobody stopping you from doing that. Senator McCaskill, we'll turn to you now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I assume that all the Cadillac tax and the medical device tax and all those taxes will be considered germane. Anything having to do with the Affordable Care Act that has to do with taxes is germane. And I guess the point we would make is that when you start dismantling the ACA piece by piece, it has an indirect effect on the entire operation of the ACA. I mean, it's going to raise premiums. It's going to, in fact, what I would ask of JCT, will we have a distribution analysis, a new one, that will show the impact of this? Because the people this is going to hit are the people that don't get insurance at work. They're the small business people out there that are buying on the exchanges that make a little too much money to qualify for the subsidies. That's who this is going to hit. That's where those premiums are going to go up, as you all well know. So the people this is going to hit are middle-class people that ostensibly this whole bill was supposed to be about helping. So the way I get it is we're going to make their insurance more expensive, create 13 million uninsured people, all to make sure that pass-throughs get a 5 or 6% cut in taxes, unless, of course, you're a small pass-through and happen to be doing certain kinds of work. I won't get into the complexities. But golf course owners, real estate developers, massage parlor owners are going to get a break, but on the other hand, we're going to be charging them more for their insurance. Will we have a distribution table?
Senator McCaskill, I don't have an amendment to examine our order of work is we would estimate the revenue consequences of any modification that the chairman might propose, and then we try to produce a distribution table. So it's unlikely that the distribution table would be available at the time that as soon as we complete the work on the revenue table, but we would work towards providing a distributional analysis.
I think it'd be really,
Senator Scott wants
it'd be really important,
so we'll
Mr. Chairman, for
recognize
us to get
Senator
the
Scott at this
distribution,
point.
the
Senator
distribution analysis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Supreme Court has already ruled, Senator Thune has pointed this out, Senator Toomey has reinforced it, that the individual mandate without any question is a tax. So the question is, who's paying that tax? The reality of it is a very simple answer. Very simple answer. Households under $25,000 of household income, 1/3 are paying that tax. Out of the entire folks who are paying the tax, 80% of the folks who are paying the tax today live in a household under $50,000. If we are seriously concerned about hardworking Americans, let's look no further than the current debate over the individual mandate and its impact on low-income Americans. $25,000 household is less than half of the average income in South Carolina. And yet 1/3 of the folks who are paying the penalty, who are essentially having a higher tax rate, live in households under $25,000. Why? Because they're paying a tax. $50,000 threshold, 80% of the folks, that is slightly less than the average income in South Carolina. 80% of the folks who are paying this tax are folks who live in a household under $50,000. If we're talking about doing the right thing for the middle class, if we're talking about doing the right thing for hard-working Americans, here's a good place to start: cutting their taxes.
Mr. Chairman?
Senator Cornyn was next.
Mr. Chairman, I'll yield my time back. Senator Scott made my point better than I could.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Chairman? You ready to vote?
I think Senator Brown.
One brief comment, Mr. Chairman.
And I'd like to make a quick closer, and Senator Carper.
Well,
Can you
Senator
recognize
Brown?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be brief. I listened to all this, and I don't think my colleagues are thinking much about individual people, that how this is going to affect their lives. I'm puzzled that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle just can't help themselves. This is at least the fourth time. Now, this is a bunch of people sitting around a table. All of us have government health insurance, insurance paid for by taxpayers. And it seems my colleagues are just sitting around, just these unrelenting efforts to find ways to take health insurance from people in our states. In my state, 200,000 people are getting opioid treatment right now because they have insurance under the Affordable Care Act. And we sit around here as privileged members of the Senate with great titles and good pay and insurance paid for by taxpayers, scheming up ways. This comes out of a Republican lunch today when they were talking about, we can't give up on getting rid of the Affordable Care Act. Let's try to find a new way, and they're doing it through this bill. I just puzzled by the brain power that my colleagues, and there's a lot of brain power on the other side of the aisle, my colleagues are willing to put into these unrelenting efforts to take people's health insurance away. And this is their fourth try, at least their fourth try this calendar year, and I'm just puzzled by it, Mr. Chairman.
I'm prepared. Senator Wyden.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Carper would like to speak, and then I'd like to just restate the motion so everybody knows what we're talking about.
Okay, Senator Carper.
Thanks. Mr. Chairman, you said about 5 or 10 minutes ago, you cautioned us to be respectful of one another, and I can appreciate that. I think most of us try to abide by the golden rule, treat other people the way we'd want to be treated, and I would just ask you today to think, how does this line up with the golden rule? I know that's something that you believe in. I know it's something Senator Grassley believes in, and there are others that are here. I'm not so sure that it's consistent. I want to go back in time. I want to go back in time maybe 2 months. And I spent a fair amount of time in this room 2 months ago on a committee that I'm not even a part of. And it was a Health, Education, Labor, Pensions Committee. And under the leadership of Lamar Alexander and Patty Murray, they, for 2 weeks, held bipartisan hearings in this room. And they brought in governors, bipartisan across the country. They brought in insurance commissioners, bipartisan from across the country. They brought in health economists. They brought in health insurers. They brought in providers for health insurance. And the theme that emerged and what they were trying to focus on is how do we stabilize the exchanges, which I think our president is intent on destabilizing. But their focus was how do we stabilize the exchanges to bring down the cost of coverage in the exchanges.
Whatever it is.
And there was general agreement that there were 3 things, if we would do them, that we would stabilize the exchanges, we'd have more insurers offering insurance in the exchanges, and that competition would bring down prices significantly. Sometimes, some folks have said by as much as 30 to 35%.
You're going to do what?
They basically gathered, there seemed to be a consensus that 3 things we ought to do in order to stabilize the exchanges. Number 1, make it clear that these CSRs, cost savings reductions, which are really a way to bring down the cost of copays, deductibles for folks who are low income, make sure that that's not going away. Make it clear that that's not going away.
Yeah,
Number 2, said we need some kind of reinsurance program. Make it clear that, like much as we've done in Medicare Part D, that we have a backstop there for really expensive cases that might be that the insurance companies might be otherwise stuck with paying. Third thing they said we ought to do is continue to have the individual mandate and not get rid of it. And several of our witnesses said we could reduce the cost of premiums in the exchanges by as much as 35% if we would do those 3 things.
What?
If we would do those 3 things.
I can't hear you. What? Okay.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I just walked us back in time 2 months. I want to walk us back in time to 1993. In 1993, I was a governor. I was brand new governor of my state. And in 1993, a senator named John Chafee introduced legislation that was reported to this committee. And the legislation that he introduced was actually ideas that were brought to him by the Heritage Commission, as I recall. And those ideas were turned into legislation that was co-sponsored by 23 Republican senators. It was an alternative to Hillary Care. An alternative to Hillary Care. And among those 5 ideas that were introduced in that legislation, that 2 of the finest people on this committee, you, Mr. Chairman, and Senator Grassley, co-sponsored, was legislation that said every state should have an exchange. There should be a sliding scale tax credit to bring down the cost of coverage for low-income people. There should be an individual mandate to make sure that the exchange has a healthy mix of people, young and old, healthy and unhealthy. There should be an employer mandate, and there should be a prohibition that said insurers cannot refuse to cover people with a pre-existing condition. That was a Republican alternative to Hillary Care. In the end, Hillary Care didn't go anywhere, and neither did the legislation that 2 of our colleagues co-sponsored. You had a good idea. That bill was a very good idea. And for the life of me, I don't understand why you've been running away from it. This administration and so many of our colleagues have been running away from it for years. I think this president says he attacks it because it's Obamacare. He thinks Obama had something to do with it. He had nothing to do with it. He had nothing to do with it. It was an effort by this committee to find a bipartisan plan or proposal around which to rally to extend coverage to people who otherwise wouldn't have it. I would just say, Mr. Chairman, if the shoe were on the other foot and something like this were introduced, which really is a major change in the bill, and we asked for, or you asked for like another 24 hours to think about it and offer amendments, I think we'd probably say yes. That's the way we would treat you. We put ourselves in your shoes. And I would just urge you to do that today. Give us 24 hours. Treat us the way we would like, hopefully treat you. And let's just move on. This is not the way to develop bipartisan consensus. In fact, if anything, this just diminishes the trust and confidence with one another and takes us in the wrong direction. I urge us not to go there.
Hey, Senator Wyden.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to be brief because Tom Carper, who is always trying to bring people together, is always a gentleman, has said it very well. And let me just kind of make 2 quick points, and then I'll offer my appeal of the ruling of the chair. First, we have learned in the last hour that this tax bill will now be a major health care bill. We just learned that. The individual mandate is an integral part of the Affordable Care Act. And rumors abound about whether it's going to be completely repealed or partially repealed. But the bottom line is, as Senator Carper just said, is senators ought to be able to respond and have the tools to do so. So I had originally asked unanimous consent that members have until 5 p.m. tomorrow to submit additional amendments, and that any amendments relating to the Affordable Care Act that's within the jurisdiction of this committee be considered germane. The chair ruled that my unanimous consent request was denied, so I ask for a vote, Mr. Chairman, on appealing the ruling of the chair, and would now ask for the yeas and nays.
Mr. Chairman, just a point of order for one moment, because maybe I don't understand what's happening here. Can I just raise a point?
Go ahead.
Would it be possible that we will get an amended chairman's mark that includes a major health care provision, and that your ruling would deny us an opportunity to amend that provision that's added that wasn't in there before? Is that what the ruling's about?
Yes.
Okay. Well, the individual mandate is in the Internal Revenue Code, as I understand it. So I think you can amend that.
So we will be able to offer amendments that will not be subject to the chairman ruling them non-germane and out of order?
As long as they apply and are in the Internal Revenue Code, that the chair would uphold them.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to have the yeas and nays on my appeal of the ruling of the chair, because as Senator Cardin pointed out, there are a lot of unanswered questions with respect to this dramatic new development that turns this tax bill into a health care bill. I ask for the yeas and nays on my appeal of the ruling of the chair.
Okay, yeas and nays?
Yeah. Right. For colleagues, I'm asking for a repeal of the ruling of the chair, which means that those colleagues who agree that this would be basic fairness, which I do to a brand new matter, would vote aye. I'd ask for the clerk to call the roll.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Grassley?
No.
Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Crapo?
No.
Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Roberts?
No.
Mr. Roberts, no. Mr. Enzi?
No.
Mr. Enzi, no. Mr. Cornyn?
No.
Mr. Cornyn, no. Mr. Thune?
No.
Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Burr?
No.
Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Portman?
No.
Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Toomey?
No.
Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Heller?
No.
Mr. Heller, no. Mr. Scott?
No.
Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Cassidy? Mr. Cassidy, no. Mr. Wyden?
Aye.
Mr. Wyden, aye. Ms. Stabenow?
Aye.
Ms. Stabenow, aye. Ms. Cantwell?
Aye.
Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Nelson?
Aye.
Mr. Nelson, aye. Mr. Carper?
Aye.
Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Cardin?
Aye.
Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Brown? Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Bennett? Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Casey?
Aye.
Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Warner?
Aye.
Mr. Warner, aye. Mrs. McCaskill?
Aye.
Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Chairman votes no.
Senator Isaacson just came in.
Mr. Isaacson, no.
Announce the results.
Mr. Chairman, the final tally is 11 ayes, 14 nays.
Okay, now let me just restate what happened. There will be no extension of the amendment deadline. You all have your amendments filed. There are 60 blank ones. You can use them as long as they comply within the scope, which is the Internal Revenue Code. And we can move on from there. But that's where we are.
That wrapped up the second day of work by the Senate Finance Committee on the Republican tax reform plan. They'll return for day 3 tomorrow, beginning live at 9 a.m. Eastern. Watch it here on C-SPAN 3. Earlier today, Attorney General Jeff Sessions testified before the House Judiciary Committee. New York Congressman Gerald Nadler asked the Attorney General about George Papadopoulos and his proposed meeting with Russia. Here's part of what he had to say.
We now know that, one, the campaign had communications with the Russians through Mr. Papadopoulos and others, and two, you seem to have been aware of the fact at the time. So let's try and correct the earlier testimony now for the record. Yes or no? Did you chair the March 31st, 2016 meeting of the National Security Advisory Committee?
I did chair that meeting.
Thank you. Yes or no? Did Mr. Papadopoulos mention his outreach to the Russian government during that meeting?
He made some comment to that effect,
Yes.
as I remember after having read it in the newspaper.
I asked for yes or no. I don't have time.
Yes, all right.
There are reports that you shut George down, unquote, when he proposed that meeting with Putin. Is this correct, yes or no?
Yes. I pushed back, I'll just say it that way, because it was...
Yes. Your answer is yes. So you were obviously concerned by Mr. Papadopoulos' connections and his possibly arranging a meeting with Putin. Now, again, yes or no, did anyone else at that meeting, including then-candidate Trump, react in any way to what Mr. Papadopoulos had presented?
I don't recall.
Okay, so your testimony is that neither Donald Trump nor anyone else at the meeting expressed any interest in meeting the Russian president or had any concerns about communications between the campaign and the Russians?
I don't recall it.
Okay. Now, we know from multiple sources, including the Papadopoulos guilty plea, Carter Page's interview with the Intelligence Committee, and Donald Trump Jr.'s emails, among others, that contrary to your earlier testimony, there were continued efforts to communicate with the Russians on behalf of the Trump campaign. We have established that you knew about at least some of these efforts. They caused you such concern that you, quote, shut George down. I want to know what you did with this information. Yes or no? After the March 31st meeting, did you take any steps to prevent Trump campaign officials, advisors, or employees from further outreach to the Russians?
Mr. Nadler, let me just say it this way. I pushed back at that. You made statements that he did, in fact, at the meeting. I pushed back.
We know that. But did you, after the meeting?
No, I'm not. I have to be able to answer. I can't be able to be put in a position where I can't explain.
I'm asking you.
I'm not going to be able to answer if I can't answer completely.
Well, you said you pushed back. We accept that. After the meeting, did you take any further steps to prevent Trump campaign officials, advisors, or employees from further outreach to the Russians after you stopped it or pushed back at that meeting?
What I want to say to you is you allege there were some further contacts later. I don't believe I had any knowledge of any further contacts, and I was not in regular contact with Mr. Papadopoulos.
So your answer is no because you don't think there were any such contacts. So
I'm not aware of it.
Okay. So I was going to ask you a question of did you raise the issue with various people, but your answer is no.
To the best of my recollection.
Okay. So your testimony today is that you communicated with nobody in the campaign about this matter after the March 31st meeting because nothing happened.
Repeat that.
Your testimony, therefore, is that you communicated with nobody in the campaign about this matter after the March 31st meeting.
I don't recall it.
You don't recall. At some point, you became aware that the FBI was investigating potential links between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. After you became aware of the investigation, did you ever discuss Mr. Papadopoulos' effort with anybody at the FBI?
Did I discuss the matter with the FBI to ask them questions about what they may have
Did you
found?
discuss the Papadopoulos question with the FBI?
I have not had any discussions with Mr. Mueller or his team or the FBI concerning any factors with regard to this
Nobody else at the
investigation.
FBI either?
No.
At the Department of Justice?
No.
At the White House?
No.
Any member of Congress?
Well, I don't know if these conversations may have come up at some time, but not to obtain information. With regard to your broad question, I don't recall at this moment, sitting here, any such discussion.
Okay, I have one
it's important for me to say that.
The time of the gentleman has expired. We've got a lot of people waiting to ask questions.
That was just part of what Attorney General Jeff Sessions had to say earlier today in front of the House Judiciary Committee. Watch his entire testimony tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN or whenever the House adjourns. Other primetime programming on C-SPAN 2, a hearing looking at the policies of the U.S. House of Representatives on sexual harassment training. And here on C-SPAN 3, the governors of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands testify on hurricane recovery efforts.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal, live every day with news and policy issues that impact you. Coming up Wednesday morning, Indiana Republican Congresswoman Susan Brooks discusses efforts to combat sexual harassment on Capitol Hill. Then Connecticut Democratic Congressman John Larson reviews the GOP tax reform efforts. Also, former Obama White House Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Advisor Lisa Monaco talks about preventing future terror attacks. Be sure to watch C-SPAN's Washington Journal, live at 7 Eastern Wednesday morning. Join the discussion.
Now a discussion on efforts to combat the use of social media platforms by global extremist groups. Panelists examine how social media is being used to recruit and radicalize individuals and what new technologies can be used to help companies identify and remove extremist content. Held by the Counter-Extremism Project, this is an hour and a half.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. At long last, I think we're ready to get started. My name is David Ibsen. I'm the Executive Director of the Counter-Extremism Project, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon for our discussion, Rights and Responsibilities of Social Media Platforms in an Age of Global Extremism. For those of you who may not be aware, our group, CEP, is an education, research, and advocacy organization working to combat extremism worldwide. In addition to researching extremist entities and their ideologies and formulating, developing, and implementing counter-radicalization programs in communities around the world, CEP also works to pressure, expose, with the hopes of degrading extremist financial and communication networks and online and internet networks in particular. And this part of our work in the online space has been of continuous importance to us as our organization has grown. And the reason is that extremists continue to demonstrate their ability to successfully misuse and weaponize the internet to radicalize, recruit, and inspire acts of terrorism with tragic results. And we've seen this very recently, unfortunately, in the case of the Halloween attacker in Manhattan, Saipov. When he was apprehended, he had almost 4,000 images on his phone. 90 videos of ISIS material on his phone, including material that directed how to use a truck or a vehicle as a weapon of terror. Similarly, Salman Abedi, who killed 22 people in Manchester, England, following a concert tragically, was helped in part by instructional videos that he found online on how to build a bomb that he found on YouTube. And through our research, CEP, very disturbingly, we found that some of that same content was still available on YouTube full 2 months after the attack occurred. But we are seeing progress being made. Just recently today in the New York Times, there was a long story about how YouTube has finally acceded to demands from civil society, counterterrorism professionals, and pressure from the government, and decided to remove completely material from Anwar al-Awlaki, American-born, notorious AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula cleric who inspired and has connections to dozens and dozens of attacks. So our guest today will discuss these issues and the myriad challenges posed by extremists operating online, and also discuss how tech, the private sector, government, and civil society can best respond. I'd also add that the issues that we're going to discuss today, the misuse of technology platforms by hostile actors, hostile foreign actors, private sector accountability and responsibility, and the changing perceptions of Silicon Valley towards Silicon Valley amongst policy practitioners, the media, and the public generally, obviously resonate beyond just extremism and terrorism, and they touch upon a number of different kind of issue contexts and policy contexts. So we hope that it'll be informative to you if you're interested in illicit contact online, illicit commerce online, accountability amongst the private sector, or just issues related to free expression and free speech in the digital age. But before we get started, and before we welcome our distinguished lineup of experts and to appropriately begin today's program, it's a pleasure to welcome someone whose legislative career has been devoted to protecting the security of U.S. citizens, Senator Ron Johnson of the great state of Wisconsin. Senator Ron Johnson was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2010. He's the chairman of the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. He previously served as ranking member of the committee's subcommittees on oversight of government management and federal contracting oversight. Senator Johnson also serves on the committees on the Budget, Commerce, Science, and Transportation, and Foreign Relations. Prior to being elected to the U.S. Senate, Senator Johnson worked for 31 years at Pacor LLC, a polyester and plastics manufacturing business which he co-founded in 1979. Senator Johnson received a BSB accounting degree from the University of Minnesota, and he is the proud father of 3 children and resides in Oshkosh, Wisconsin with his wife, Jane. Please all welcome Senator Ron Johnson.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you all for coming here. Good afternoon. Really do appreciate this, the counter-extremism project. It is extremely important. I think you're raising incredibly important issues, serious issues, things that we really need to discuss as a society. For my part, opening the conference here is, rather than steal the thunder of excellent guests, the type of people, by the way, that we would call into our committee and pick their brains and get their information, I'd like to provide a slightly broader perspective. I am chairman of the Homeland Security Government Affairs Committee. I come from the business background, so the first thing I did when I took over that chairmanship is we developed a mission statement, established goals. The mission statement is pretty simple: to enhance the economic and national security of America. We established 4 goals on the Homeland Security side of the committee: border security, cybersecurity, protecting our critical infrastructure, which has an awful lot of cybersecurity component to that, and then countering violent extremists no matter what the origin. We've focused an awful lot of time and attention, and really, in Congress, yes, we write legislation. It's hard to get it passed. I really view my primary role as chairman of that committee is to hold the hearings, bring in people like Dr. Freed and Fran Townsend and Peter Bergen, the experts on the subject matter, to do a problem-solving process. Define the problem, provide the information, try and establish achievable goals. And so that's certainly what I've been trying to do. And we held a hearing just last week. Now, this was a confirmation hearing for what I hope will be the next Secretary of Homeland Security. One of the things I did in that hearing is I just laid out, starting with the Sikh temple shooting in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, 20 different mass murders. It was a pretty depressing list. It ended, of course, with the November 5th massacre at Southern Springs, Texas, where 26 souls were lost, 20 individuals wounded. In that 20 list, or that list of 20 incidents, 262 souls were lost, over 1,000 people were wounded. Later that night, Sunday night, November 5th, I was with my family, and my daughter just asked the question I think we're all asking ourselves. What's happening? Why is it happening? And what can we do about it? Now, these aren't very easy questions to answer whatsoever. President Obama, let's face it, had a fair amount of criticism when he compared terrorism, the casualty counts, to other things. For example, overdoses. And by the way, that's a huge problem in this nation. A growing crisis, 64,000 deaths last year. Gun deaths, 38,027, about 2/3 of those are due to suicide. Auto accidents, 37,000. And I just ticked off a list of 20 dating back a number of years where 262 individuals were killed in acts of terrorism. Why do we concentrate so much time and effort on those acts of terrorism when let's face it, the body count is so much lower? Well, I would argue the reason we devote that much time and attention, the other deaths are part of life. They don't threaten to shut down potentially our economy. Remember after Charlie Hebdo and other terrorist attacks in France, the city of Brussels shut down, not because there was a terrorist attack, just because of the threat of a terrorist attack. And so what is happening in this world, the evolution of primarily Islamist terror, but let's face it, that list of 20 attacks, they were homegrown terrorists. These were people either inspired or copycats, not always tied to Islamic terror. But what is so concerning about Islamic terror is that it is reaching a new phase. I often take a look at Islamic terrorism from the viewpoint of phases. We had the pre-9/11. You could almost date it back to the attack on the Olympic from Palestinians. But specifically, Al-Qaeda type attacks began really in the mid-'90s when they tried to bring down the Twin Towers with a bomb that killed about six people, I think injured close to 1,000. And then 9/11 happened. And then we had the post-9/11 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And then, of course, the rise of ISIS after we foolishly bugged out of Iraq, declared victory, and allowed ISIS to rise from the ashes of what was a thoroughly defeated al-Qaeda in Iraq. We are dealing with something else now. We finally defeated the physical caliphate. They're doing a little mop-up operation, but the caliphate as a physical entity is pretty well over. A year ago in our threat hearing, the FBI director talked about a diaspora, a spreading of terrorists around the world. Now, in our last threat hearing, the current FBI director and Nick Rasmussen, the head of the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, said that diaspora is not as severe as we thought it was. There were a lot of dead enders. They fought and they died, which is a good thing. But recently at a hearing in Senate Foreign Relations, Chairman Corker pointed out that we have troops in 19 different countries where that threat exists. So al-Qaeda, ISIS, Islamist terror has spread. It has evolved. It has metastasized. And we are entering this new phase, certainly demonstrated by ISIS, where they are using social media in incredibly sophisticated, incredibly effective ways. And one of the reasons I was quite critical of the Obama administration, if you remember President Obama after Fallujah fell, referred to ISIS as the JV team. And then about 6 months later, Mosul fell. And we saw those acts of barbarity during 2014. The fact that we did not immediately put all of our effort into defeating ISIS and ending that caliphate, that territory, every day the caliphate existed. Every day it wasn't losing, it was perceived as winning. And was gaining more and more adherents online and inspiring them through social media. That is, I think, what our reality is today. That is the phase we're in right now, as ISIS has spread to at least these 19 countries where we have troop presence and probably beyond. And they have their social media platform set up, and they'll continue to inspire it. And so the question is, what do we do about it? Well, let me just give some basic direction. First of all, we had to end that physical caliphate. We've done that. We must address the recruitment, the incitement, the training on social media. And that's really what this conference is all about. And you're going to hear some real experts on what we need to do. We have to have a rational legal immigration system. We have to realize that the people that we allow into this country and gain permanent residency, we have to assimilate them. One thing America does better than probably, for example, in France or Belgium, we do assimilate immigrants in this country better. But we have to ask ourselves the very serious question, how many can we accept? How many can we assimilate? Any nation must, any nation, any sovereign nation has to secure its border, has to control immigration. But assimilation is key. And I do want to quote a philosopher, Karl Popper, in 1945 described the paradox of tolerance. He said, unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are not intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed, and tolerance with them. America is a very tolerant society. We value that almost above anything else, our freedom, our liberty, but our compassion and our tolerance. But in this new era, in this new phase, with this new threat to national security, we really need to ask ourselves very serious questions. You know, and you'll hear this on the panel today. We don't allow child pornography on the internet. It is illegal to download it. And yet we allow how-to guidebooks, how to create a bomb, how to buy a truck, the right truck to buy with 2 wheels in the back axle so when you run somebody down, you have a greater chance of killing that individual. These are serious questions our society has to ask. How much can we really tolerate, understanding that paradox of tolerance? If we tolerate too much, our tolerance itself will be ended. it's vital that we improve our intelligence gathering capabilities. Our first line of defense against violent extremists, whether it's homegrown or whether it's foreign-born, is a robust and effective intelligence gathering capability, together with strong alliances so we can share that intelligence. We can't be all places at all time. Now, I realize when we start talking about intelligence gathering, we start talking about civil liberties. In a free society, you always have that delicate balance between civil liberties and security. And unfortunately, I'd have to argue today the fulcrum point of that delicate balance has got to tip towards security. Or again, we will lose our society. There will no longer be tolerance. One thing we have to be prepared to do is be relentless in our pursuit and destruction of violent extremists. I mentioned before, one of the huge strategic blunders of the last administration was bugging out of Iraq, declaring victory, allowing ISIS to rise again, creating that additional threat. We can't afford to do that anymore. One of the things we've discussed is authorizations for use of military force under this new threat. I just want to quick read the three that are at stake right now. Currently, we are operating under the authorization for use of military force signed into law on September 18, 2011, 7 days after 9/11. This is an authorization that works. It reads, the President is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines. Now, here's the problem. He determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11th or harbored such organizations or persons. Now, I think if you read that authorization, I certainly don't come to the conclusion that it applies today. But some lawyer somewhere said it did, and by precedence, it does. Now, we've had a debate about whether we have a new authorization for use of military force. The problem in debating a new one is apparently we don't have enough votes to pass one that will actually give the commander-in-chief the ability to be tenacious and relentless and actually achieve victory. Let me read you another effective authorization use of military force. This would actually be a declaration of war. This is what Congress passed first on December 8th, 1941 against Japan, and then December 11th, 1941 against Germany. This is a declaration of war. The President is hereby authorized and directed to employ the entire naval and military force of the United States and the resource of the government to carry on war against, in this case, Japan, and to bring the conflict to a successful termination. All the resources of the country are hereby pledged by the Congress of the United States. That's called an all-out effort. And I would argue, in this phase, this generational struggle, this generational war that we're in, we need that kind of all-out authorization declaration. Now, in February 2015, again, you take a look at the 2001 authorization, say it really doesn't apply to the situation. So there was a debate in Congress. The problem is the authorization the administration requested simply wasn't that type of relentless, tenacious request for an authorization. Let me read it to you. The President is authorized subject to the limitations in subsection C. That doesn't sound like an all-out declaration, does it? To use armed force of the United States as the President determines to be necessary and appropriate against ISIL or associated person or forces as defined in Section 5. By the way, that definition is quite good. C, limitations. The authority granted in subsection A does not authorize the use of United States armed forces in enduring offensive ground combat operations. The only reason the physical caliphate is over is because this President used ground troops, not a whole lot of them, thousands, not tens of thousands, but gave the commanders on the field the authority to end the caliphate, and it's been ended. So again, it's extremely important not to hamstring any administration, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, a commander-in-chief, in actually winning a war. Finally, we must rebuild our military. I want to just quick show you a little chart here. This is a history of United States spending on defense. Kind of looks all downhill racer, doesn't it? I want to give you the actual stats on this because it's pretty interesting what we continue to do to the finest among us in terms of providing military support. In the 70s, we averaged about 5% of our GDP for defense spending. It was a high of about 7.6% under Richard Nixon, and then Jimmy Carter drew the military down to about 4.4%. In the 80s, we averaged about 5.5% of defense spending. That ranged from about 4.7% under Carter up to a high point of 6% under Reagan. We entered the Cold War. And so during the 90s, that was the peace dividend, the end of history. And so we went from about 5% under George H.W. Bush to 2.8% under Bill Clinton. Then 9/11 occurred. So then in the aughts, or whatever you call this decade, that last decade, we averaged about 3.9%, a high of about a low of 2.9 to a high of 4.6%. Then, of course, we declared the war over in Iraq. And once again, we started hollowing out our military to last year, we spent 3.2%. In 2016, 2017, the best estimate I get is about 3.1%. We are not devoting the national resources we need to defend our nation, to keep the homeland safe. Now, this is all within the context of the fact that neither party is seriously addressing what I consider the number one threat, and Admiral Mike Mullen said the same thing. The number one threat to our national security is our debt and deficit. We are $20 trillion in debt. Over the next 30 years, it is projected we're going to run another at least probably closer to $129 trillion worth of deficit. How can we spend enough on military when we're already in debt over our heads? We have got to start getting serious about addressing the fact that we are mortgaging our kids' future. And let me end on that note, because I wanted to broaden this discussion. My daughter asked that question. What can we do about this? Why is this occurring? What's happening? I was in Shawano High School just on Friday, and I had one of the senior girls ask me almost the exact same question. What can we do about it? Now, we'll talk about some specific solutions in terms of social media and what we can do there. But I would argue the broader problem is a cultural one. And one brought about, to a certain extent, by government spending that has exacerbated the problem. Mortgaging our kids' future and not solving a problem. We spent $22 trillion, by some estimates, on the war on poverty. Did we solve poverty? When we engaged in that war on poverty in the mid-'60s, poverty rates were about 15%. Today, they continue to be at 15%. Back in the 60s, 8% of births were out of wedlock. Today, it's 41%. We have weakened the foundational premise of our society, the family. And it's not good. And I'll end on this note. Because I was in a school, and it's all about what we're teaching our children. Back in the 40s and 50s, in most public schools, a sign was hung on the wall. It had 10 attributes that those schools, those public institutions were trying to instill in the young people they were teaching. I want to just read you the list and ask you if you think this is what we're trying to instill in our young people today, whether we are doing it in a very overt fashion. Got to find my list. It starts with honesty, loyalty, trustworthiness, courage, respect, compassion, initiative, perseverance, responsibility. I love this next one, contemplation, optimism, and adaptability. I don't care what specific fixes we're talking about when it comes to social media, how much money we spend in the military. If we don't rededicate ourselves to instilling those types of values in our young people, and if we aren't as tenacious and relentless at making sure our young people grow up with those types of values, anything else we do may simply be all for naught. So again, I thank CEP for holding this, I think, extremely important forum, and I think you'll enjoy the next panel. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Senator Johnson, for your remarks and for raising all these very interesting and complex issues. As Senator Johnson said, we now have a very distinguished panel of guests who will explore these issues even further. It's my honor now to introduce